Eliza Hart learned early how to take up less space than she occupied. She arrived before most people, left after they did, and made sure her presence never disrupted the rhythm of the room. Her clothes were chosen for function, not attention, dark tones, clean lines, nothing that invited comment. She kept her hair neat, her posture composed, her expressions carefully neutral. Nothing about her asked to be seen. That was deliberate. Pain had taught her precision. Where to step, when to pause, how to breathe through discomfort without letting it reach her face. She moved through her days the way one moves through narrow corridors, quietly, carefully, always aware of what might brush too close. At work, Eliza was dependable, efficient, the kind of woman people trusted because she never demanded anything from them. Her reports were flawless, her timing impeccable. She spoke only when necessary, and when she did, she kept her voice level and her words contained. If someone asked how she was doing, she answered automatically. "I'm fine." The words required no thought. They had been practiced too many times. The building around her moved with polished certainty. Elevators gliding, doors opening on cue, conversations overlapping in controlled noise. To everyone else, it was just another day structured by routine. To Eliza, it was another day of management. Not tasks. Not deadlines. Herself. She avoided unnecessary movement. Ate when she could remain still. Kept her world small enough to predict. Pain, when it surfaced, was treated like background interference, acknowledged privately, corrected silently, never addressed directly. Attention led to questions. Questions led to consequences. And Eliza had learned that consequences rarely landed where they were deserved. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that restraint like hers did not disappear into the background. Not to everyone. At the far edge of the room sat Park Min-ho. He did not speak. He did not interrupt. He did not look impressed. Publicly, he was a man of influence. Quiet wealth. Controlled presence. Privately, he was something else entirely. A figure who understood systems not by how they presented themselves, but by what they concealed. While others focused on screens and numbers, Min-ho watched posture. Timing. The subtle tells people revealed when they thought no one important was paying attention. When Eliza stood, the room followed her data. Min-ho followed her. The fraction of a second she took before moving. The way her hand brushed the table, steadying herself without looking. The tension held too carefully in her shoulders. It wasn't weakness he noticed. It was discipline pushed too far. As Eliza finished and returned to her place, the meeting shifted forward without pause. Chairs adjusted. Voices resumed. The moment passed, clean, efficient, forgettable. Then Eliza miscalculated. Just slightly. Enough. The room reacted slowly. Park Min-ho did not. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, he was already standing, already there, already reaching for the one person who had never asked to be seen. For the first time in a long while, Eliza felt attention settle on her fully. And she understood too late that silence had limits. Because when someone like Park Min-ho notices your restraint, it is no longer something you control. Eliza Hart woke before the alarm because her body no longer trusted rest. The room was still dark, the city outside muted and distant, but she moved with practiced certainty. No hesitation. No wasted motion. She swung her legs from the bed slowly, testing balance before committing weight, then stood and waited a breath longer than necessary. Only when everything held did she move again. Routine came first. It always did. Water heated. Coffee measured. Steam rose in the quiet like something alive, something that might draw attention if she let it. She drank carefully, standing instead of sitting, keeping her body aligned the way she'd taught it to stay. Upright. Contained. Manageable. The mirror above the sink reflected a version of her the world accepted without question. Hair pulled back neatly. Skin calm, expression neutral. She adjusted nothing that didn't need adjusting. Anything excessive invited notice. Anything indulgent suggested comfort she didn't feel entitled to. Clothes followed the same rule. Dark, simple, deliberate. Fabrics that didn't cling. Sleeves that covered more than they revealed. Shoes chosen for stability, not style. Nothing about her appearance asked to be remembered. Pain surfaced briefly as she moved, sharp, precise, familiar. She acknowledged it the way one acknowledges weather. Noted, inconvenient, unavoidable. Her breath tightened for half a second, then evened out again. She did not stop. Stopping turned sensations into questions, and questions were dangerous. By the time she left the apartment, everything was back in place. The walk to work followed the same path every day. Eliza kept her pace steady, neither rushed nor slow enough to stand out. She avoided eye contact without appearing unfriendly, adjusted her steps to move with the flow of the crowd. She had learned how to disappear inside motion. At the office, she arrived early enough to settle before anyone else could comment on her presence. Her desk was immaculate, papers aligned, screen angled just so. She checked her calendar, reviewed her notes, prepared for meetings she would speak in only if necessary. Her value was precision. Her safety lay in restraint. When colleagues filtered in, they greeted her with nods and polite smiles. She returned them evenly. No warmth that might invite conversation. No distance that might provoke curiosity. She had mastered the narrow space in between. "How are you?" someone asked in passing. "I'm fine," Eliza replied without pause. The words were smooth, automatic. They cost her nothing anymore. Throughout the morning, she worked without interruption. Numbers made sense. Patterns resolved. Focus kept everything else at bay. When discomfort crept in, she adjusted subtly, shifted her weight, slowed her breathing, anchored herself to the edge of the desk until it passed. No one noticed. That was the point. By midday, the strain had settled deeper, no longer sharp but persistent, like a quiet pressure she carried everywhere. She ate lunch at her desk, not because she preferred it, but because movement drew eyes. Eyes led to questions. Questions led to explanations she could not afford. Silence had rules. Eliza followed them carefully. It had kept her employed. Independent. Unchallenged. It had kept her intact. As the afternoon approached and meetings began to fill her calendar, she straightened her shoulders and smoothed her expression once more. Whatever the day required of her, she would provide, efficiently, quietly, without complaint. She took her seat at the table like she always did. Still, composed, unremarkable, and determined above all else to remain unseen. Eliza Hart did not believe silence was strength. She believed it was arithmetic. Every choice had a cost, and speaking had always been the most expensive option. She had learned that early, learned it in small, forgettable moments that added up to something permanent. A question asked too plainly. A concern voiced at the wrong time. A truth shared with the assumption that it would be handled carefully. It never was. The consequences were never dramatic enough to point to. No shouting. No threats. Just doors that closed more softly than before. Invitations that stopped arriving. A shift in tone that suggested she had misunderstood her place. The world had taught her that nothing punished you faster than being inconvenient. So she learned to calculate. When something felt wrong, she wrote it down privately. Dates. Times. Details stripped of emotion. She kept records the way others kept diaries, telling herself that documentation was protection. That if she ever needed proof, it would be there. What she did not tell herself was how rarely proof mattered. Endurance became a skill. She trained it deliberately. She learned how to absorb discomfort without letting it change her face. How to redirect conversations before they lingered. How to turn moments sharp enough to cut into something dull and survivable. She watched how people responded to silence, how it smoothed over complications, how it reassured those who didn't want to look too closely. Silence made her easy to manage. That, she understood, was why it worked. There were times she considered breaking it. Moments when the weight of what she carried pressed so heavily that the idea of saying anything at all, felt like relief. But fear was persuasive, and memory even more so. She remembered how quickly sympathy faded once it demanded action. How often concern turned into scrutiny. Scrutiny was dangerous. Once you were seen as a problem, you became one. So Eliza stayed quiet. She chose her battles by refusing to fight them. She told herself she was being practical. That survival required compromise. That enduring something was better than risking everything. Her body adapted before her mind did. Pain became familiar, predictable. Something she could work around if she was careful enough. She stopped seeing it as a warning and started treating it as background noise. A signal she could mute with discipline and control. Others mistook that control for resilience. They praised her composure. Her professionalism. The way she never seemed rattled, never emotional. They called her reliable, low-maintenance, strong. Eliza accepted the words because correcting them would have required an explanation. And explanations came with consequences. At night, when the world was quieter and calculation loosened its grip, she sometimes wondered what it would feel like to speak without measuring the aftermath. To be heard without being managed. To exist without bracing herself for the price of honesty. By morning, those thoughts were gone. Silence wrapped itself around her again, familiar and precise. It was not comfort. It was control. And as long as Eliza kept it, she believed she could endure anything, even if enduring meant slowly disappearing. Silence had kept Eliza Hart safe, but it had not kept her whole. The cost revealed itself slowly, in pieces small enough to ignore. It lived in the way her world had narrowed without her noticing. Fewer calls answered. Fewer places she lingered. Decisions made not by desire, but by risk assessment. She told herself it was efficiency. In truth, it was erosion. She stopped sharing things first. Opinions softened before they reached her mouth. Ideas trimmed down to what could not be questioned. It was easier to let others lead, to stay just behind the center of attention where nothing sharp could find her. Over time, that distance became habit. Then it became absence. People assumed she didn't mind, that she preferred it this way. Invitations slowed, then stopped entirely. Not out of cruelty, just convenience. Eliza never asked for space, but she never claimed it either, and the world filled the gap without her. There were moments she missed and couldn't quite name. Conversations that ended before she arrived. Decisions made without her input, despite her competence. She watched opportunities pass the way one watches trains from a platform. Aware they were leaving, aware she was not on them, telling herself she hadn't planned to go anyway. Her body carried the rest of the cost. What she endured quietly began to demand payment. Sleep came in fragments. Mornings felt heavier than they used to. There were days when standing required a pause she pretended was thoughtfulness. She learned how to brace without flinching, how to adjust without drawing notice. The discipline that protected her also depleted her. No one remarked on the change because it happened gradually. Strength was assumed. Silence confirmed it. Sometimes she caught her reflection and didn't recognize what had been taken. Not beauty, she still had that in a subdued way. Not intelligence, her mind remained sharp. It was something less visible. A looseness. A sense of permission. The ease of occupying space without apology. She had traded those things carefully, piece by piece, for stability. And stability had delivered exactly what it promised. She was unchallenged. Unquestioned. Unseen. The worst part was how reasonable it all felt. Silence hadn't arrived as loss. It arrived as relief. Each time she chose not to speak, something difficult was avoided. Each time she endured, something stayed intact. The damage only became clear in hindsight, when she tried to remember the last time she had been fully present without calculating the aftermath. That memory was harder to find than it should have been. Eliza told herself this was the price of surviving in a world that punished noise. That disappearing a little was better than being broken entirely. That there were worse things than being overlooked. And maybe there were. But as the days passed, and the weight she carried grew harder to ignore, a quiet truth settled beneath her careful routines. Silence had not only taken her pain, it had taken parts of her life she might never get back. Park Min-ho entered the room without announcing himself. He never needed to. The shift came anyway, subtle, instinctive. Conversations lowered by half a degree. Chairs adjusted. People straightened without knowing why. Authority did not follow him into a space. It settled there ahead of him, waiting. He took his seat with unhurried precision, dark suit immaculate, expression unreadable. To anyone unfamiliar with his reputation, he looked like any other powerful man accustomed to being obeyed. To those who understood how influence truly worked, Min-ho was something else entirely. He did not watch outcomes. He watched restraint. While others focused on agendas and projections, Min-ho observed posture. Timing. The moments when people paused before speaking, and the reasons they didn't. Silence to him was never empty. It was a record of pressure applied over time. That was how Eliza Hart came into his awareness. Not when she entered the room. Not when she took her seat. She did nothing that demanded attention. That, in itself, was notable. Min-ho noticed the absence where confidence usually lived, the way she placed herself just outside the natural center of gravity. Close enough to contribute. Far enough to disappear if necessary. He watched her without staring. The meeting unfolded as expected. Voices overlapping, ideas traded with practiced confidence. Eliza spoke only when required. When she did, her voice was steady, measured, stripped of anything unnecessary. The data she presented was clean, incisive, quietly superior to what had come before it. Others noticed the numbers. Min-ho noticed the pause before she stood. The way her hand brushed the edge of the table, grounding herself with emotion so small it almost vanished. The controlled breath she took before speaking, not from nerves but from containment. It was the kind of discipline that came from long familiarity with limits. He had seen it before. Not in weakness. In endurance. As Eliza finished and returned to her seat, approval rippled through the room. Polite nods. Low murmurs. The meeting moved on without friction, satisfied with its own efficiency. Minho was not. He watched as the color faded slightly from her face. Watched the moment her shoulders tightened, as if compensating for something unseen. Watched her calculate stillness with the care of someone who could not afford to misjudge it. This was not fragility. This was restraint stretched thin. Minho leaned back, expression unchanged, mind already adjusting. The room continued, oblivious, confident in its blindness. That confidence had always annoyed him. Systems trusted what they could measure. People trusted what made noise. Minho trusted patterns. Eliza Hart was one. And when patterns reached their breaking point, they did not announce themselves. They failed quietly. He kept watching. Because men like Park Min-ho did not wait for collapse to confirm what they already knew. They acted the moment restraint began to crack. Eliza misjudged the moment by less than a second. It was nothing dramatic. No stumble that drew gasps. No sound loud enough to interrupt the room. Just a shift of weight that didn't resolve the way it should have. A careful balance finally refusing to hold. She felt it before anyone saw it. The quiet slide of control, the warning her body had been issuing all morning now sharpened into insistence. Her hand reached for the table automatically, fingers closing around the edge with more force than necessary. For a breath, she told herself it would pass. That it always did. The room kept moving. Voices overlapped. Someone turned a page. The meeting advanced without hesitation, confident that nothing important had changed. Eliza tried to straighten. The effort cost her more than it should have. Her vision narrowed just slightly. The edges of the table seemed farther away. She focused on her breathing, slow and deliberate, the way she had trained herself to do. In. Hold. Out. She kept her face composed, willing her body to follow. It didn't. The room noticed too late. Park Min-ho noticed immediately. He was already standing when Eliza's grip tightened, when her shoulder dipped just enough to betray the strain. Chairs scraped as others reacted, confusion rippling through the space, but Min-ho moved with certainty, closing the distance before gravity could finish the work restraint had been doing for years. His hand was steady at her arm. Not tentative. Not urgent. Precise. Eliza froze, instinct flaring. Exposure hit first, sharp and humiliating. She tried to pull away, to apologize, to recover the shape of herself the room expected. "I'm fine," she said automatically, the words practiced smooth. They felt thin the moment they left her mouth. Min-ho didn't contradict her. He didn't reassure her either. He adjusted his stance instead, anchoring her without drawing attention, his presence forming a barrier she hadn't asked for and didn't know how to refuse. Up close, there was no hiding what restraint had cost her. Her breath was shallow, her muscles rigid with effort. The faint tremor she worked so hard to suppress ran through her arm despite her control. Min-ho's gaze moved with unsettling accuracy, taking in details no one else had thought to look for. This was not surprise. It was confirmation. The room hovered in uncertainty, unsure whether to resume or pause, whether this interruption required concern or discretion. Someone suggested a break. Another reached for water. Solutions offered themselves without understanding the problem. Min-ho lifted his hand slightly. The room fell silent. "This meeting is over," he said, his voice calm, unraised, impossible to misunderstand. Authority settled instantly, heavy and unquestioned. Min-ho turned his attention back to Eliza, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You don't need to explain." The words landed with unexpected weight. Not because they demanded anything, but because they didn't. For the first time, Eliza felt the burden of holding herself together shift. Not vanish. Not resolve. Just move fractionally from her alone to somewhere else. Min-ho steadied her once more, already guiding her away as the room recalibrated around his decision. Eliza realized, as the doors closed behind them, that her silence had finally failed her. And someone had been waiting for that moment all along. The room emptied behind them without sound. Min-ho did not rush Eliza, but he did not allow hesitation to root her in place either. His hand remained steady at her back, guiding rather than pulling, adjusting his pace to hers with an attention that felt unnervingly precise. The corridor beyond the meeting room was quiet, carpeted, insulated from the noise she'd just left behind. It felt like stepping out of weather. Eliza was acutely aware of the distance growing between herself and everything familiar. She tried to pull away once, more out of instinct than resistance. "I can walk," she said, even as her legs betrayed her with a faint tremor. Minho glanced at her, expression unchanged. I know, he replied. You don't have to. It wasn't permission. It was acknowledgement. They entered a smaller room set back from the main corridor. Glass walls that turned opaque at the press of a switch. The door closed with a soft, final sound. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. The air felt heavier, contained, as if the space itself had been designed to keep things from leaking out. Minho guided her to a chair and waited until she was seated before stepping back. He did not hover. He did not retreat. He positioned himself where she could see him without feeling watched. You're safe here, he said. The words unsettled her more than they comforted. Safety, in her experience, had always been conditional. Eliza folded her hands in her lap, willing them to stay still. I don't want trouble, she said quietly. It wasn't a plea. It was reflex, sharpened by years of calculation. Minho studied her for a moment, not as one might assess value, but as one assesses truth. Trouble already found you, he said. You've just been carrying it alone. The observation landed too close to something she had spent years keeping contained. She opened her mouth to deny it, to soften it, to redirect the conversation the way she always did. The effort felt suddenly pointless. You won't be returning to that room, Minho continued, his tone even. Not a suggestion. A statement. Her breath caught. You don't know what this costs, she said. I do, he replied without hesitation. I also know what it costs to leave things as they are. He turned slightly, already reaching for his phone. He spoke in a low voice, words clipped and precise, names and instructions exchanged in a language she didn't understand. Doors were mentioned. Arrangements made. The cadence of command was unmistakable. Protection unfolding quietly. Eliza watched, heart pounding, as the reality of it settled in. She had been removed, not just from the meeting, but from the environment she had learned to endure. The careful invisibility she'd built was no longer shielding her. Minho ended the call and met her gaze again. From this moment on, he said, you're not handling this alone. The certainty in his voice left no room for negotiation. Eliza leaned back slightly, the chair solid beneath her, the room sealed around them. Isolation pressed in. Not empty, but deliberate. Protective. Unfamiliar. Whatever had been holding her life together before had loosened. And whatever came next would not ask her permission. The quiet settled in slowly once the door sealed. Without the buffer of distance or movement, Eliza became aware of everything she'd been holding in place. The tension in her shoulders. The shallow rhythm of her breathing. The way her hands clenched and released in her lap as if testing whether they were still under her control. Minho didn't speak. That somehow made it harder. I didn't fall, Eliza said at last, the words escaping before she could weigh them. Her voice was steady, but it took effort to keep it that way. If that's what you're thinking. Minho leaned back against the table, posture relaxed, attention sharp. I wasn't, he replied. The simplicity of the answer unsettled her. Silence had always given her room to maneuver, to soften what needed softening, to retreat if necessary. Here it felt thin, exposed. It's not serious, she continued, habit guiding her now. Just bad timing. I'll be fine. Minho's gaze didn't shift. He watched her the way he watched patterns, patiently, without interruption. You're protecting something, he said quietly. The words landed with more force than accusation ever could. Eliza inhaled sharply. I'm protecting myself, she corrected, though the distinction felt fragile even as she said it. He nodded once. Then tell me what you're protecting yourself from. She almost laughed. The sound would have been hollow. You wouldn't believe me. Try me. There was no challenge in his voice. No coaxing. Just certainty. Eliza looked down at her hands. The faint tremor was no longer something she could ignore. This was the moment she usually escaped, redirected, deflected, endured until it passed. But there was nowhere to go. And for the first time, no one was asking her to justify herself. Silence failed her. The truth came out unevenly. Not as a confession, not as a speech. In fragments. Small things first. Boundaries blurred under the guise of familiarity. Comments dismissed as harmless. Warnings disguised as concern. She spoke of documenting everything, of choosing carefully when to speak and when not to, of learning how much she could absorb without drawing attention. She spoke of the system that listened politely and did nothing. Her voice tightened when she reached the part she had never said out loud. The moment silence stopped being strategy and became necessity. When fear settled into routine. When pain became something she managed instead of escaped. Minho did not interrupt. He did not react the way she expected. No outrage. No disbelief. His stillness was heavier than any response. When Eliza finally stopped, the room held the weight of what she had released. Minho exhaled slowly. "You were never invisible," he said. "You were being ignored." The distinction burned. "I didn't want this," Eliza said, meaning all of it. The attention, the intervention, the consequences she could already feel approaching. "I know," Minho replied. He met her gaze then, and whatever she had been carrying alone shifted irreversibly. Silence no longer stood between them. Truth, once spoken, had momentum, and it would not be contained again. Minho did not explain what he was about to do. He rarely did. After Eliza finished speaking, he stepped away without another word, moving with the quiet certainty of someone whose decisions were already in motion. The door closed behind him, leaving the room intact and altered all at once. No raised voices followed. No urgency. Just absence. That was when Eliza understood something she hadn't before. The danger was no longer loud. Time moved strangely after that. She wasn't sure how long she sat there, listening to the muted rhythm of the building beyond the opaque glass. Footsteps passed without stopping. Voices never rose. At some point, a glass of water appeared on the table beside her. Later, a folded jacket. She hadn't heard anyone enter. The system was still functioning. Just not for her. Her phone vibrated once. No name. No explanation. "You're finished for the day. Transportation is arranged. Don't return to your desk." The message did not threaten. It did not reassure. It simply stated reality, the way gravity did. Eliza stared at the screen, heart pounding, trying to read into what wasn't said. Whatever was happening, it was already beyond her reach. Elsewhere in the building, the afternoon quietly unraveled. Meetings ended early. Calendars were adjusted without comment. Doors that were rarely closed stayed that way. Conversations happened behind frosted glass, voices lowered, careful. People who had once felt untouchable found themselves waiting, uncertain why. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. Access shifted. Permissions disappeared. Paper trails were followed with sudden interest. Authority moved hands so smoothly it looked accidental. The same system that had once absorbed Eliza's silence now responded to her existence, though she would never see the full shape of it. When Minho returned, the room felt different. He looked the same as before, composed, precise, but something in his stillness had sharpened. He didn't sit. He didn't ask how she was feeling. He met her gaze and nodded once. "It's handled," he said. Eliza's stomach tightened. "What does that mean?" "It means," Minho replied evenly, "that no one involved will be in a position to hurt you again." The phrasing was deliberate. Not punished. Not exposed. Removed. She searched his face for something, regret, satisfaction, anything that would explain the speed and ease of it. There was nothing there. Only finality. "And the others?" she asked quietly. "They'll understand the cost of not noticing," Minho said. Relief crept in, unwanted and sharp-edged. It tangled with fear, with the unsettling knowledge that protection had arrived only when power decided to care. Silence had never moved the world this way. Minho stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. "You're not returning to your desk," he said. "Tonight or after." Eliza swallowed. "You're changing my life." "Yes," he replied. "I am." Power had moved. Quietly. Completely. And Eliza knew with sudden clarity that silence no longer protected her. Something else did. The city looked different from above. Eliza stood near the window, arms folded loosely around herself, watching the lights stitch quiet patterns across the dark. The space behind her was expansive and controlled, designed to feel effortless. Nothing here announced itself. Not the muted hum of the air, not the way doors closed without sound, not the presence she sensed more than saw. She was safe. The realization settled slowly, like warmth seeping through fabric she hadn't chosen. Safety had never arrived so cleanly, so completely. It pressed in around her, heavy and undeniable. Minho moved through the room with the same unhurried certainty he carried everywhere. He hadn't explained where they were going when he guided her out of the building. He hadn't needed to. The world she'd known had closed behind her, and the alternative had been simple. Remain where she had been, or step forward into something else. "You can stay here as long as you need," he said, his voice steady, factual. "No one will reach you without my consent." The words landed with finality. Eliza turned to face him. "And after?" Minho considered her for a moment, as if weighing how much truth to give. "After," he said, "we decide what comes next." Decide. Not return. Not resume. The language mattered. She nodded, though something tightened in her chest. Being seen had changed everything. Being protected had ended something she hadn't realized she was already losing. Invisibility. "I didn't ask for this," she said quietly. "I know," Minho replied. "You endured instead." The acknowledgement was precise. It cut through her defenses without force. Eliza thought of her apartment, her routines, the careful anonymity she had built and guarded. It hadn't been much, but it had been hers. Now even the silence around her belonged to someone else's design. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Minho met her gaze without hesitation. "Awareness," he said. "Honesty." "Time." "For what?" "For you to understand what it means to be protected by me." The answer wasn't comforting. It wasn't meant to be. Eliza turned back to the window. Below, the city moved as it always had. People choosing routes without calculating risk, speaking without rehearsing consequences. She felt the distance between that life and her own stretch thin, and then snap. She was seen now. Truly seen. She was safe. Unquestionably so. And she was no longer free in the way she once had been. Minho joined her at the window, close but not touching. "This doesn't have to be a cage," he said. "But it will never be invisible." Eliza closed her eyes briefly, letting the truth settle where habit used to live. Silence had carried her this far. It had kept her alive when nothing else would. But it had also erased her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She opened her eyes. Survival had brought her here. What came next would require something different. Something louder than silence and steadier than endurance. Behind her, the room remained quiet. Ahead, the city waited. And Eliza stepped into a life where safety cast a shadow, and invisibility was no longer an option.